Hello, everybody. This is Dan Housman here, and I'm here with Omer Saka from Roland Berger. We're here with the Novel Cohorts podcast with Graticule, and we're going to talk about some exciting stuff relating to target product profiles and some new work we're doing together with Roland Berger to come up with a way to help clients sort through this question of digital. So I wanted to introduce Omer. We've worked together in the past, and we were colleagues when I was at Deloitte, and we've stayed connected throughout some of the years across, given that we've been in the industry for a long time in real world data. Um, and I'll let Omer introduce himself and what Roland Berger is, and then we'll get into the topic of digital target product profiles.
Hey Dan, thanks very much. It's on this strange day when the weather is not that nice in Boston, and it is here in Basel. You got your kids down in bed, and I'm feeling the weather myself. But it's just this is the best time to actually talk about interesting things to hype your mood up. I think, don't you think? So I
Absolutely.
think. Well, my name is Omer. I'm a physician by background education. I guess I've been in advisory, professional advisory services for the past 15, 16 years. As you rightfully said, we met at Deloitte. Before we called anything real world data, when we just named it data, I had the chance to work since the early 2000s in chronic diseases, particularly with deploying non-clinical trial data to understand effectiveness of clinical pathways. And for the past 15, 16 years after academia, together with you, I guess most of it, I think at least 14, 15 of it together, when we were designing value propositions for new treatments, and that they don't have to be drugs. Naturally, they could be new modalities of providing care to patients. They could be medical devices. They could even be digital solutions themselves to enhance the provision of care. We've been struggling to get efficient ways of real world data to actually support the pathways for our clients. Now, why, in our opinion, I'm going to say in our opinion, if you don't mind, Dan, because
Oh,
I know
fine.
that
Like
I know
we're
you will
aligned on this one.
contradict me. I know you'll contradict me. That's one of the most exciting things about working with you and Graticule. You guys, you've got a very good dialectic, contradiction-based improvement system. That's what I call, R&D in real time, I guess. So, but we're going through a really uh, I'm going to say difficult times, but it's actually beyond difficult for farm industry, especially. There has been a major increase in different types of innovation. Obviously, oncology with the Moonshot project, particularly Obama's policies, has benefited from that particular increase. But other therapy areas too. There's a lot of new drugs coming in, and I guess recently also with the increasing discussions in the US healthcare system. Are we paying too much for drugs? Do we have the right methodology to understand the value of drugs? And do they actually are they able to convert what they claim as their efficacy and safety endpoints? Are they able to convert those to effectiveness? So I think in there we're in agreement that the best way to prove that any treatment modality, be it a drug, be it a medical device, be it a supplementary clinical pathway, the best way to demonstrate this is by data. And, of course, we need clinical trials, but we also need anything that we can get our hands on within the construct of evidence-based medicine to support the enhancement of value. And I think it would be fair to say that this is where we've been battling many battles in several different areas and disease areas. Won't you agree?
Well, back to this contrarian view, I'd say we've had a lot of success. It's not all battles. And I think, when you look back in time, the drug industry started in an era where there was nothing digital. Like there really wasn't. Like, you made a drug and you got to market, and sometime in the 70s or 80s, whenever it was, the wave of drugs that came out then, they designed how the drug industry works. Maybe they designed it in the 50s, right? Um, and the rest of the world's been moving at this big accelerated pace to adopt new things. Like when I grew up and I was just watching like the Super Friends with my kids with these cartoons that were made with who knows what kind of technology, that was like high tech in the 70s with Hanna-Barbera. Um, and you had television, you could transmit images across the wire, but you were doing everything on paper back then. You were probably running clinical trials on paper back then. Well, we're living in a world where everyone's got a mobile supercomputer in their pocket and multiple mobile supercomputers all over their body, right? And on top of that, everything is completely networked and has been for a long time. And the result is we have this new world which wasn't how the farm industry was originally designed. And we've been slowly bolting on ways to electronify the old pharma industry. And there's this big opportunity that everybody knows about, which is how to make the new pharma industry that's truly digital. And we're not there, right? Like this is a slow moving space, slow moving industry. I'll agree that there's challenges, but we keep taking advantage of them. And I think this is
Ah,
where we're getting into this discussion here about, you know, when we thought of our original products, we thought about them living in this analog world, right? It's a pill you take
absolutely.
on your desk when you want to take your pill at the right time of day with your, non-digital watch with the hands clicking around, right?
Absolutely.
What
Let me remind you, I don't know if you would remember, I think this was maybe 15, 16 years ago when one of our clients in Switzerland, you had flown from Boston and I was there together with you. We organized that big workshop to demonstrate what digital health can do. And we made them build these pillboxes which would
Right.
blink when it was time
Yeah.
for the patient to take it. Because, I mean, there's I guess people were getting into the mobile phones, into the supercomputers in their pockets, but still digital was a bit of a toy. You really needed to think beyond what could be capable to understand what of these solutions could actually uh, pave any path for through the journey of a drug. It was, 15 years ago, we needed to do this with, demonstrations and with actually tools that, if you remember, we built,
Yeah, yeah. No, we did like little kits for
in your
IoT.
offices in
Yeah.
Boston, and we found an electronic engineer. They kind of added bits, and we made the people build those little tubes, and we built spoons that if the dose of a drug was too much, a syrup was too much, then the spoon would give a blink that you're taking too much of
Yeah.
that drug. So we've of course moved on from that. And it is not to say the farm industry isn't looking at all of the benefits of their drugs as holistically as possible, especially if you think about the way we design economic models, the way we try to understand the clinical benefits, the economic benefits, the benefits to healthcare system, the benefits to next of kin, the intangible benefits of something that a treatment pattern that would enable the next of kin to have maybe an easier life because the drug would improve mobility or it wouldn't necessitate a patient to see a physician every so often, so on and so forth. I think we have been working this with target product profiles, and I think the whole regulatory landscape needs to thank FDA for coming up with the concept of target product profile. It really made it easier to visualize, to understand how value transforms into something that could be commercializable and relatively easily recognizable between different specialty areas, all the way from, R&D, clinical development, to medical affairs, to marketing, to health economics, to market access, to commercial teams. You can come up with concepts where you agree, and then you can adapt to different countries' health policies, and there you go. You got a value proposition. But I think it's my view, and when I use the word battle, this time I hope you'll agree with me. It's not that it's been a battle that people were in blood or anything. It's a battle because both you and I are exposed to various different digital enablements, let me call it that way, that could become an integral part of a drug provision, either at the follow-up stage, at the provision stage, at the stage of obtaining outcomes, be it patient-reported outcomes, be it technology-reported outcomes, that could actually enhance this value. And I think the battle was that we were always trying to sneak in these ideas and to demonstrate to our colleagues in the industry to say, there is a return on investment here. Not only there's a return on investment for patients, because they're going to have a better compliance, they're going to be able to monitor their stages of their disease better. It's going to give feedback, create feedback loops to the physicians, to the healthcare system, so they can actually trace down the line how their patients are doing. And when they need a little warning sign or when they need a little pat on the back, you're doing really good, you don't need to come to the hospital again, so on and so forth. I think the battle was, have we been systematically able to integrate these little microchips, little elements into the pathway, into target product profiles? I think that's what we're going to talk about today, because we've got a methodology now. We can
Yeah.
somewhat integrate them all in a holistic fashion. At least that's what I
And,
think we're trying to
and I
achieve.
think that the thing that's been interesting, and it's fun for us, I think, um, is the digital world is not stable. Not stable meaning there's always new things happening. So in the
Absolutely.
in the biology world, things stay pretty stable. Like, human biology may be evolving, but at a very, very slow pace, right? And the things that are changing are maybe what drugs we're putting into our body and what we're eating. And there's things that are maybe changing our biology a little bit. As you can see, we're getting more obese, so things obviously are happening. But at the same time, if you look at a drug that's a molecule, it's an API, it's maybe formulated differently. Most of that stuff, that's the core product profile type components, they're nice and stable. So you can count on them. The digital world just keeps changing. Like we came up with all this AI stuff where suddenly ChatGPT lands on the scene and everyone's brain is exploding, trying to understand what does that mean for what we can do to observe things and learn things, right? And that's things people usually point out, but then there's all these behind the scene things that happen in digital, like mergers and acquisitions driven by private equity in industries to suddenly say, well, you used to have this very fragmented universe, and now you have this very consolidated universe with these digital opportunities that you didn't have before. So
Yeah, I think you're
I guess I'm saying
hitting the nail
the fun thing
on the
is we
head.
can landscape a lot with digital, whereas you don't do as much landscaping with biology, except at the beginning and middle in preclinical, to understand you know how does a pathway work. But thinking about how the pathway works for a human being in a digital world wandering through the universe, that's really dynamic. And not being able to
Absolutely,
look at it
absolutely.
is a gap, because it's going to be the way to differentiate, among 20 GLP drugs or whatever it's going to be, because every drug's going to have competition. If there was no competition, you might not care. But you do care. And certainly if there's no reimbursement, you're not going to be able to have a drug. And
Yes,
reimbursement is going to depend on, does it achieve benefits, and achieving benefits require, behavioral things. Like the number one thing I think in improving medicine is human behavior, right? That was documented in a clinical
absolutely.
support
Especially outpatient
analysis,
drugs. Yeah,
right? So if we want to change
absolutely.
human behavior, digital is how you change human behavior. You look at things like social networks, they just banned social network apps for kids. The reason is they have such a huge effect on their behavior.
Absolutely.
In
Absolutely. I
Australia,
think
it's like we need to
let's
figure out how to take advantage of it for the better in medicine.
we've seen all three stages, I think. When we were referring to those workshops we used to run 15, 16 years ago, that was the time we were trying to introduce what digital technologies are and what can they do. So this was more like an eye opener for several of our colleagues that we worked together. In my opinion, and I hope you agree, we are in a state right now when we work with clients, it is more like we feel like kids in a big Christmas market. There's a lot of things around, and oh, shall I just purchase this? Would it actually work with my drug? Oh, this is like a compliance informer application. Here's like a blood glucose monitoring application. Here's like if we can actually monitor people's speech patterns, would we be able to understand how Alzheimer's or multiple sclerosis may be evolving? Could we be able to catch people at prodromal stage in nervous disease, central nervous diseases? It's a bit like going to a Christmas market. You may actually purchase a lot of things you don't need. You don't know how it's actually going to work with your patients exactly because of the way you said, because patient behavior is a major determinant on how these drugs actually work. Also, how do patients think that they work, whether or not it's good for them. Also, how the physicians think that they work, whether they are good for the patients. So I think in this stage, we should really get out of the Christmas market attitude and, buy a lot of trinkets that we may not use. We realize a few days after Christmas break, I said, why did I buy that little, mulled wine mug when I had about 25 of them already, and none of them is actually nice because they're too small. They don't keep the coffee hot enough, or I can't take them with me wherever I want to go. So I think this is the third stage where we need to start talking about how do you enable your already existing value proven target product profile by using digital technologies. And that doesn't mean looking for trinkets that are already available in the market. That is with a broad mind, understanding your value proposition, understanding your evidence gap in its entirety, and even going back to the market. Yes, there could be things you can plug in. Some of the variables could work for you. Some of the patient platforms you may want to build, that'd be great and very valuable, both in terms of educating patients and physicians, but also giving feedback to the system, to improve the pathways of how drugs should be used. But also it can enable the creation of new technologies when there are actually gaps in your target product profile or in your clinical pathway that you introduce a drug to a patient. I think that's where we come to our concept of digitally enabled target product profiles, and that's why we kind of in a fashion that was iterative, we realized, throwing technologies here and there when we work on a value design for one of our clients may not work. They may not have the budget. It needs to be systematically done. It needs to be attached to evidence plan, and it needs to be understood and planned for upfront with very tactical budgets created and very tactical return on investment ideas explored so that it becomes a part of that investment package. It becomes a part of what this solution at the core of it, the drug perhaps, or the medical device, but what that solution will achieve in the market with patients, with the healthcare systems. I think that's why we are, and that's why we want to talk about digitally
So,
enabled TPPs.
so I could keep riffing with you on this because I got so many things to respond to your comments on, but maybe we should throw up a couple slides just so the people who are watching that they kind of know what we're talking about from what's the difference
Absolutely.
between a traditional target product profile and a digitally enabled target product profile. Because I know
So
we
let's
put
start
together a
with
couple slides to,
TPP.
to
Yeah,
give
let's
you a
start
picture.
with, I'll let you
So I think
start your
you
wrap.
have the slides, right? Don't you? There you go.
Yeah, I do. Here's our first visual. Shall I let you take it away, or would you like me to start?
Um, sure, I'll go for it. You know, back in preclinical land, right? Even in target identification land. Um, we're thinking about a drug and trying to figure out how to make a drug that's gonna fit some new need in the market. And that means we're looking at, what's going to be the receptor it's targeting, what's going to be the mechanism of action of that drug, all the things you want to know in the specs, including the formulation, the frequency of dosing. Many of those pieces usually go into the drug specs at the level of, the early target product profile. But, you know, the smart companies think about it all the way over to looking at what's going to be the commercial outcome of that drug. So even back in looking at the drug specs, it may be a very cartoon view. Someone's thinking, okay, when I launch this product, what's the TAM, right? How many people we're going to have here, and what do we predict is going to be the sort of cost of the drug per dose? What's going to be the expected level of adoption? Which segments will adopt? Because you need to know that because you're going to make $100 million to $1 billion investment. And on top of that, you're looking at, segmentation of the population. If it's got some genetic marker, now you've cut it down. Is it going to be an orphan drug? Looking at some of the structures of how it's going to get moved through the regulatory processes. And oftentimes, safety and efficacy are the most important pieces to defining how it's going to be positioned long term. Is it more effective than the existing drug, or is it just safer than the existing drug with the same efficacy? Um, and part of the product profile then goes down to how can we design and measure these things with the trial, go launch it, go figure out how to get it adopted, assuming we actually have reimbursement. Now, we still have the problem of how do we communicate the right evidence back to the clinicians who are going to prescribe and the patients who are going to take the drug, and the safety and the other pieces to be able to move that thing into a mature drug that you know eventually goes off patent and goes into generic land, right? So people are looking at the target product profile from the perspective of all these phases, and it's going to keep increasing the level of information attached to it as it goes down, because from drug spec all the way to maturity, but the early drug specs almost defines the product profile to begin with. And as you go forward, you're always looking at, well, how do we do real world evidence generation? And it's a great framework, and we still use it all the time. But you can see
Absolutely.
here, it doesn't look at the digital world, right? It's very traditional, and we could have drawn this graph in 1975.
Absolutely.
Pretty similar.
Absolutely. I think,
Uh,
and as the slide title says, there is in this competitive age, in this time when we are trying to create commercially competitive drugs that not only will generate the interest from the patients, but also it's going to generate sufficient usage so that the dollars could be invested back into the system for further R&D. But beyond that, I think in a traditional TPP, we do not consider, or we do not really integrate the thing that you mentioned, the most important element, the patient behavior. There's not really any feedback loop with a traditional TPP between the healthcare system. The interactions are carried out by pharma industry employees in countries and regions and in hospitals. They try to interact with the system, but there's nothing uh, that is digitally enabled in this information age to do this in an automated fashion, or it doesn't necessarily in a systemic fashion integrate those elements, those technology enablement elements that could actually cater for patient behavior, cater for physician choice, cater for the learnings that you can capture as the drug is used in the market, that they are not as effectively deployed as possible. And certainly, even though we have been seeing regulation recently around the use of digital technologies, even for their reimbursement, DIGA in Germany, that regulation is one example from 3 years ago. Even though there's some regulation, they never do make it to the value proposition of a drug, those potential digital enablements, and nobody actually wraps it up. None of the pharma companies, although there are some of them, we've been reading a lot of articles from our colleagues in Takeda. They do talk about it, and they do talk about their drugs to be digitally enabled. But in the industry as a whole, this is still an ad hoc modality of plugging in some of the solutions on the drug, and it's a good to have. It's a market attraction. It's not really part of the fundamental value proposition of a drug or a new healthcare treatment modality or a medical device, as I was
and,
mentioning. So
and I think we also see all this impedance. Um, it's already built into the processes we see today. If I ask the average drug company, because we do a lot of work in research and development, what's one of their big R&D problems in the development side? It's recruiting patients into clinical trials. And if you break down, well, why is it so hard to recruit patients to clinical trial? There's a novel treatment that's going to solve a problem that no one solved before. Um, there's a bunch of digital problems and a bunch of human behavioral problems in patient identification and working through enrollment into a study that's a small model of what it's going to look like when you try and do prescribing. right? Because you don't know the diagnostic process because you're introducing a new
Absolutely.
intervention that didn't exist before, and it's disrupting this whole digital universe, right? And it could be we don't have a diagnostic for this drug. We don't do this genetic test, and we never had to do this genetic test because why would we do this genetic test? There's no drug for it, right? So what's going to be the pathway and workflow in the digital world to get to that genetic test? What's going to be the identification process? What's going to be the documentation process? And these are things that are happening in the digital world. Not saying it can be magically fixed immediately, but if you can't figure out how to recruit patients in trials, I can predict you're going to have a problem getting patients to prescribe or physicians to prescribe the drug for the same reasons you're having trouble getting into the studies, right? Because you don't understand the pathway by which the patient ends up on that drug. And then similarly, there's other issues that are in the backside, which is you design clinical trials thinking that's how the real world works, because you can do whatever you want in a clinical trial. You can define any measurement vector you want, and you'll rapidly run into the problem that that's not what people really do. So you end up with this impedance of practice change at scale. You have something, the clinical trials showed that if you had this nice measure that academics wrote down as a way to, I don't know, collect, you know, how someone feels, depression scale, I don't know, but a new depression scale that works well for your drug, guess what? That depression scale doesn't exist in the real world. Now you have,
Absolutely.
a global problem of having people adopt that depression scale so that someone can use your drug. And so they're connected problems that you're breaking the system when you introduce new interventions. And if you're not thinking about how the system works and how those things are going to be translated, even in your trial implementation, you're going to run into problems later when you try and do product launch and adoption and things like that. So you always want to be moving backwards, I think, if you're in strategy with inside life sciences companies of how can I fix these before it becomes, $100 million problem? When I finally have my
Bravo.
drug approved and I built a forecast and people aren't using the drug and adopting at the speed I expected because of some thing we could have fixed. And I'd say there's big, I'll call them pregnancy problems, right? You can't just throw money at some of these problems. You need time. You need to have sorted it
And
out.
you need, and as you say, you need planning in advance. So maybe if I can move to the next slide, if you don't mind, given that this
Go
is your
for it.
podcast, I'm asking for permission.
Go for it, Omer.
This is what we're talking about. So what we're talking about is these problems that you mentioned, these new metrics that you may need to develop to actually accurately measure the treatment outcomes, to accurately talk about effectiveness as hopefully a large group of patients use the treatments that are actually launched for them into the market. How do we understand how do they actually comply with these drugs? How do we understand that the right tests would need to be done? How do we follow up on what the patients would need to, or what the patients are actually doing during their time of treatment, what sort of outcomes, what sort of pain, what sort of side effects they are experiencing? And I think all of these, as you said, you know, all of these need to be planned in advance. All of these need to be planned within and integrated into the evidence plan, into the longer term achievements that a certain drug would like to have, certain levels of efficacy and effectiveness and safety that they would like to they would like to get to. So what we're saying is the secret to this recipe lies in, simply, of course, thinking about these in advance. But the complicated thing, perhaps, is to integrate these technologies. Some of them may exist, as you rightfully said, some of them may not yet exist. But alongside the product life cycle, we need to plan for wherever we may have gaps in our value proposition, wherever our clinical trial has not been able to collect sufficient data, wherever we need further emphasis, especially in the cases where some of the genetic tests, some of the, biolab tests may not even be available, like in the case of new drugs that will come to the market soon in cardiovascular diseases that will require an LP little a test, for example. How would they actually, what would they mean? What would their value mean alongside a drug's introduction cycle and alongside a drug's life cycle? And how should they be planned in advance? How should these gaps be envisioned in advance? And what would be the tactical and strategic meaning of covering these gaps in advance? This doesn't need to be done at a global level, although certainly starting with a number of base countries where you can actually create the solutions alongside your product pipeline. And you can go to the agencies, the payer agencies, the insurance agencies, the single payer system gate holders, gatekeepers, and you should be able to actually discuss with them that you're not designing, you're not selling a pill, you're not selling a lollipop to the market. What you're actually trying to introduce is the utmost effectiveness conversion from efficacy and utmost benefit to patients that will actually enable the patients to see the outcomes, enable the healthcare system to have an idea on what they should be expecting and course correct, when these expectations are not met, either on the safety side or on the effectiveness side. So that's I think what we're focusing on, both from a drugs or a clinical treatment modalities strategy on how it should be implemented, or a drug how it should be provided to the market, towards an area where you're actually targeting a healthcare problem, and then you're trying to solve the healthcare problem. This drug, this healthcare modality, treatment modality could be at the heart of it still, but actually it is connected to several different enablers, which is the reason why we call this digitally enabled target product profiles. We simplify the definition of digital here. Digital health, as you know, Dan, it's a difficult animal to capture. A lot of people think it is the heart of healthcare itself. I personally don't believe that. I think digital enablement is a very important element of the future of care, but we still need to provide care in hospitals. Physicians, we will still need to see the patients. Patients will still need to get tests done, etc. But what we're looking at is, if we were to slice and dice the use of digital technologies, we can basically look at them in three areas. One is the data itself. How do we actually collect, capture, and carry on capturing data digitally so we can do analytics, hopefully in real time, so that we can understand from an individual patient to a population cohort, what is it that we're capturing, what is it that we're achieving. The second element is to enable the personalization of care as much as possible. Technologies that are either via wearables or via applications that patients use will reflect their own experiences, their own outcomes, their own journey when they're actually on the path of either being diagnosed, or they've been prevented a certain disease from happening to them, or being prevented from things getting any worse. So the second cluster is the technologies we would use to capture that personalization. And the third group we define to be information exchange. In the third group, it doesn't have to, a technology does not need to collect data. It does not need to provide any personalized thoughts or personalized feedback to the patients or to the healthcare system, to the healthcare professionals. What it does is it trains the physicians, it trains the patients, it gives them information about when they should take their drug. It gives them information about if they're not feeling good, if they are having any issue with pain, any issue with a headache, or any issue with mobility impairment, what is it that they should do? What is it that they could do? What sort of help they could seek? So actually create this immediate response without wasting any time to mobilize whatever needs to be provided to these patients or to healthcare professions in terms of information. We divide the digital enablement in these three groups. And of course, we'll talk about an example, but is there anything that you would disagree with me on that platform? That is what we're trying to bring to our clients, rather than on an ad hoc fashion, suggest to them a certain outcome metric, suggest to them a certain use of a wearable, suggest to them a certain monitoring of, any of their biologic indicators. But what we say is we need to do this in a systematic fashion. We need to design it as a part of the value proposition, as a part of the data plan, the evidence plan. And then convert the ideas or create a prioritization of these ideas so that the companies that will bring these collective solutions to the market, they know how much they need to invest and they know how much of a benefit they would receive from these technologies in order to avoid, obviously, the deployment of unnecessary trinkets here and there.
I love to disagree with you. Um, so I think it's great to have a rubric to classify capabilities, data analytics, personalized care, information exchange. Um, the warning though is life sciences companies have finite resources, and therefore you can't have 10,000 partnerships to bring a product to market. And so many of these things can be wrapped together. And when they can be wrapped together, they should be, and that's how the real world universe works. Like some of the analytics are connected to the information exchange, some of the personalized care is connected to the two. And I think in a strategic thinking perspective, it's how can you somewhat minimize the number of initiatives you have to do to get these things done, possibly by merging those pieces back together. So you can find a way to acquire the data you need at the same time as executing integrated alerts for physicians, right? So that they don't become two different things, that they become complementary in an investment. And so when we're doing DTTP work, I think we do need to landscape out where's the best bang for your buck, right? Because it's
Absolutely.
going to be a
Absolutely.
challenge, and the big challenge when you look at a picture like this is, boy, the universe sure is fragmented. And what is special about pharma or med device or diagnostics is, whatever you want to look at as the life sciences world is fragmentation is not how they're inherently built because they're built on a one product for everyone model, right? I make Ozempic. That's what I do. I'm not going to make 10 million versions of Ozempic, so I know how to ship it if I'm Novo. So what's going to be my footprint so I can have, a solution for EMR integrated alerts that's universal, which is the hard part. And that means looking for where is scale opportunities and things like that. So just realizing that this is not intended as a way to make a million little solutions for every possible problem.
Absolutely. I love the fact that we sometimes have these little choreographed conversations and you throw a seemingly a curveball at me for me to answer it in the right fashion. Absolutely the idea. So this is a part of what I was saying at the beginning. We have this dialectic way of trying to improve what we do towards clients, and I think this is a part of it. Actually, the fundamental idea behind it is exactly what you said. Unless you cater for what are the technologies that will properly enable your value proposition in the market, that will enable you to close the potential evidence gaps that you may have. Unless you plan this out from the get-go, it's always going to be an haphazard deployment of a million different technologies in different countries, in different solutions, and they will never become economized. You will never reach scale application because you haven't been able to actually create a platform that will deploy a lot of these things together in a sense of economies of scale and target the exact point of gap that you have in your value proposition. So I think I'm gonna declare to our listeners that this was choreographed, but I think they need to know that this is one of the most important things, one of the most important outputs of what we try to achieve when we work with our clients with digitally enabled target product profile design. It is not about blue sky thinking on what they can actually implement into their patient pathway, into the product life cycle. It is exactly deploying the most cost-effective infrastructure of technologies, either in a platform or it could be obviously standalone, but in an integrated fashion. So there's conversation between data collection procedures, there's conversation between different healthcare systems which can deploy them rapidly. There is conversation between the healthcare professional with the patient. There's conversation between the patient and the actual provider of that drug. So you know, we can only understand the package of investment if we plan this in advance. When I say in advance, of course, it doesn't have to be done 5 years before a drug is deployed, but it could be, I think what we recommend is that, you think about that systematic way of evaluating value when you're designing your value proposition. You do need your medical affairs specialists. You certainly need your clinical development teams, but you also need your country teams. You also need your market access teams so that they could be packaged up with the right arguments towards the payers and towards the finance teams, that the right investment with the right packaging for a right output could be designated upfront.
So you had a bunch of value propositions here. I think people can read them on the screen, but I'd say the rough summary is, how do you end up solving for um, getting a product that's actually going to have the impact you're looking for in the population? And then that's all the way from, getting regulatory submissions, getting reimbursement, getting clinicians in a position to be able to prescribe because patients have been identified, as well as the patients are activated to solve their medical problems. So all those pieces come into play if we get this digital thing right. Um, Maybe we can look at the next slide, which I think we've done a little bit to highlight or show an example of how this is done. Um, I'll let
I'll let you
you do
start with
that.
this one. I think
We can
this
let you
this
start with
is
this one. That's
called.
fine, Omer. I'll start if you want.
Oh, yeah, I can start if you want me to. I think this was a client that we engaged. They have a drug for a rare autoimmune disease, and the point where we engaged was at the point of value development, value proposition design. This is a very common step. A lot of pharma companies, a lot of medical device companies, a certain amount of time before they launch a drug, they would like to understand, how can they make their case towards the healthcare system, towards the payers, and also for their own teams. What's the actual, beyond just some simple efficacy metrics? How should they be able to find their way into the healthcare system? How should they convince the prescribers that this is the right drug to use, this is the right solution that they would need to deploy? So we started this particular assignment with relatively conventional way. We looked at clusters of value blocks, clinical value blocks, economic value blocks towards healthcare system benefits, intangible value blocks that the patients will or the healthcare system will experience, but they may not necessarily be captured by, direct metrics. So we looked at the value proposition from a very broad sense, and from a structural perspective, obviously, it wasn't just a definition of value based on simple, they're not simple, but metrics like EQ5D. We looked at quality scores. We looked at what are the best practices in evidence-based medicine to demonstrate the very specific benefit this particular drug was bringing to the market. We did a number of analog assessments to see whether or not some of these solutions, some of these metrics were used. We looked at the practice, the clinical practice, whether it would be possible to actually put these metrics to use, because claiming that, especially in a rare disease environment, claiming that the data that you collected from a clinical trial as big as maybe 200-300 patients, would they be generally deployed? Would that be the actual case when you take the drug use from the laboratory environment of a clinical trial? When you take them to the real world, will they be deployed? We also developed financial models to try to reflect to the healthcare system players, to payers on what would be cost and outcome equation here for this particular drug. What would that mean if new treatments were to be if older treatments were to be replaced? what sort of operational issues they would need to look at, what sort of diagnostic metrics they would need to deploy. Now, when we were doing that, we came across with a few very interesting findings. Some of them were very practical in terms of the deployment of outcome measures. Some of them were very operational in the sense that who actually deals with these patients? Can we find these patients in multitude, in a group that we can actually, if it's that it would become worthwhile targeting a number of areas, targeting a number of providers so that we can actually get the biggest impact for what we'd like to do. And we realized that there are a number of digital solutions that could actually enable us to overcome both the operational problems and the actual systemic evidence related problems. And we found some key facilitators.
Yeah,
So,
and maybe to
yeah,
be more specific, of the different rare autoimmune diseases, one of which is in various forms of psoriasis. And the particular project we're trying to deal with was in dermatology. And dermatology is just an interesting space because dermatology lives somewhere inside the health systems, but also in these practices that do dermatology that have, in the last few years, and I think I mentioned this earlier, gone through a big change of roll up from private equity firms. And the impact of roll up of dermatology and private equity firms means you now have these mega dermatology providers, which is an opportunity to establish some kind of scale capability to do practice change within those groups. And I think we're seeing a lot more of that, or we had seen a lot of more of that in the last 10 years, because independent groups have become a target for PE firms, not just in dermatology. It could be in anything. It's been in ambulances. It's been in, emergency department groups. There's been roll-ups in almost every specialty of some sort where the specialties can live sort of partially in the health system, partially as an independent group because they're trying to consolidate using digital all of that knowledge, expertise, and automation that's hard to do when you're just, a practice inside of a health system where the innovation gets blocked. And then the result of all that in the case of dermatology is also that they now use integrated electronic health records. So, there's a dermatology specific electronic health record that is connected to these large rolled up derm practices, which
well,
gives
please
the
mention that we
opportunity.
found out during our investigation. This was one of the outputs of our investigation, wasn't it?
Yeah. And that, in connecting with that group, they're open to injecting new digital tools on top of it. So a new digital tool in the case of this particular product, if we go back to the original target product profile, you know, they'd been measuring certain factors of dermatology that were differentiated from the drugs of the market. So if you look at problems in dermatology, well, you have, how comfortable is the patient? What is the size of their psoriasis? How long does it last after treatment? How bad is their itch? And these sorts of factors aren't tracked in traditional systems. They keep things at a very high level. And so if you tried to compare their clinical trial that was designed off their traditional target product profile, there's no representation in the EHR to track the patient's progress relative to those specialized improvements in the drug versus other psoriasis drugs, and which patients are the best targets based on the differentiated properties of the drug. And so the opportunity there was to introduce new workflows and forms to collect that data, both from the patient, keeping in mind measuring itch at a visit, for example, once every year with a dermatology visit isn't going to be as effective as adding a patient-reported system that's a digital app they can use to track their own experience, right? So that's something that they're going to see and most likely want integrated into their electronic medical record. You could try and make something that's totally independent, but the patient themselves thinks of it as part of their engagement with their healthcare provider. So, for those of us who use like Epic MyChart, that's where I get my lab values. That's where I get a survey before my visit. That's where I I'm expecting to see things that are connected to my point of care visit. And therefore, thinking about the digital wrapper around a psoriasis drug is, well, how do we do that? And so one way to do it is through those EHRs. Another way is that the patient advocacy groups for psoriasis, which are the places where we can find these specialized patients with specialized needs, already engage them pretty effectively. And they're already engaged in providing tools for those patients as a support function that they think is core to their um, mission. And so, therefore, again, there's another window of opportunity to partner with the advocacy groups that are providing the My Psoriasis app to plug in the kind of things that are necessary for this product to be differentiated in the app. And it's a win-win for the advocacy group because it's new funding for them to improve their application. And furthermore, it's not like you're marketing a drug, you're helping patients to track some of their symptoms. And if the drug is the right drug, that'll go through. If the drug is a different drug, you obviously have to have good medical ethics when you're doing digital products, and it can sometimes be a blocker, and you have to think through all this, right? Because you can't just implement advertisements in the middle of the care providers, the advocates workflow, but they don't have the resources. They don't have a big pile of money that comes in either from healthcare providers or from the patients themselves to improve these products. They're all strapped for resources, so that the design of a sort of pilot through implementation is, well, how can you translate? How can you translate these opportunities into practice within those healthcare provider groups that are dealing with those special patients, those advocacy groups who are dealing with special patients, and the existing infrastructure they use, which in this case is the EHR system that's specialized for dermatology, and the advocacy group for psoriasis is an app that the patients already use to track their disease. And so now you end up with a nice package. And on the backside of that, from the analytics perspective, forming these partnerships can also get into, well, now we can look at long-term outcomes. Right now, we can look at the patient journey and understand what other digital tools could be added. And it's funny because like we started off talking about like, well, think about all these IoT devices, right? Which was the big hot thing when me and Omer were assembling pillboxes. You know, IoT isn't at the center of all this. Maybe, right? Maybe it's just, you know, cellular phones and EHRs. But it could be more if it's a different disease. Right. And it could be that you could take some of the burden away from that patient by taking devices that are doing, measurements that are natural off of whatever the specific device does. Um,
And the I guess one of the practical couple of practical points we need to mention. Number one, all of these things that we found, the three main points that are mentioned on the key facilitators, was a result of that investigation of that project. They were all costed. They were all they return on investment assessment was provided. And of course, they found their way into the payer documents. So they were used in enhancing the pricing argumentation because they would be a part of a whole package, not just a single pill value story. And the solution was kind of provided all together. I think it's in these kind of slightly less mainstream rare diseases, it may become a bit more easy, if I can say easy, to find these type of game-changing parameters for the launch of a particular treatment modality. Because without those elements, the argumentation on the value of a drug becomes very difficult to be reflected on. Of course, in broader areas, like you mentioned Ozempic earlier on, Dan, if you talk about GLP-1s, the scope of what you can achieve is a lot broader. Of course, then we're looking at more the long-term outcomes. We may be even looking at issues around mental health. We're looking at, daily satisfaction or satisfaction of daily activities of daily living. So we're looking at broader concepts. They're not as pinpointed as reflected in this particular example that we've presented here. but
Well,
the
I mean, like, but
concept doesn't
Omer, like
change.
in a GLP-1, like, sure. I mean, I think your Ozempic and Zepbound and the Novo versus Lilly world, that's the trillion-dollar product space. But there's 30 companies that are making GLP-1 drugs that are in phase 2 and 3 clinical trials.
Of course.
So they're going to be exactly in this set of problems. Everyone will be, which is, oh, I designed a drug that reduces my nausea with GLP-1 drugs. Well, how are you tracking that? How are you going to show that that actually is
Absolutely.
better? How are you going to show that the patient's quality of life is better? Why are you charging $1,000 more per year because you lowered people's nausea? Can you prove it? Because that's going to be hard to prove. Like where is the volume of nausea measurement in like the data that flows in from your real world data system? It doesn't exist. I guarantee it. I'm sure of it. I'm sure like you have nausea on the problem list or not, which tells you jack crap about whether your drug is better than Ozempic. I'm pretty sure. So if I'm in one of these GLP-1 drug companies, I'm thinking about that. Or I'm thinking about the other problem, which is reimbursement, right? The big barrier to adoption from the provider side is they're completely burnt out filling out prior auths where they get rejected all the time. Can you make it easier for them? So your digital tool might just be a reimbursement automation framework that helps them to collect the data they need to be able to communicate things back and doesn't have everybody frustrated that they can't get access to these drugs, which would definitely be good for the Novo and the Lillies of the world, right? So there's lots of pieces here, right?
And I think, I mean, I think so. I presented this concept in a few places at the recent EU Access Forum in Barcelona as well, as you know. And one of since you mentioned reimbursement, one of the payers actually rose his hand and he said, "Can I say something about this concept that you're presenting?" And he said he's in one of the he's an expert in one of the top payer agencies in Europe, and he said that a value case came in front of them in one of the recent psychosomatic drugs that there was a lot of doubt about the value proposition, but this particular drug was packaged with patient outcome measurement, actually patients a progression and safety measurement tool. They were not convinced of the clinical trial results of the particular product, but they actually loved the technology, the digital technology that was discussed, that was packaged as a part of the drug. And with condition that this would be provided with the drug itself, uh, they said under that condition, it could be this particular drug could be included in the reimbursement as a reimbursement case. I think these cases are still ad hoc. You know, the reason why, as Graticule on the data side, I'm a partner at Roland Berger. Roland Berger is a strategy consulting firm, 70 years old, formed in Europe initially, but it's all across the world. I think and obviously Dan Graticule is one of the most innovative, in my opinion, one of the most interesting real world data companies that has partnerships all across the world, which is the reason, why it brings us together, because we obviously worked together on these things several times before, but also because we can understand and we can deep dive into the reimbursement requirements in each country. We can deep dive with our partnerships, whether or not these agencies would be willing to deploy, obviously enabled by us, that we can actually create the platforms for them to easily deploy these technologies. The difficulty, I guess, we're finding that we can create that solution. We now need to change, or we need to convince our colleagues, not necessarily just in GLP-1 space, but in any other innovative treatment modality space, that they need to think about their TPPs in a digitally enabled fashion. They need to think about it as a part of their main value proposition, and they need to equip themselves to go to payers with their pricing proposition with those tools that are actually surrounding and improving the benefit that they expect to have for patients in the healthcare systems.
Well, I think the good news here is drug development's really, really expensive. Right? Like if you hear anybody talk about it, like, well, it costs $1 billion to bring a new drug to market, you hear some ridiculously large number. Um, Digital development isn't as bad, which means you get a lot of bang for your buck. If you think about it and come up with a good strategy, obviously some folks might be concerned that said, no, you're kind of tethered down to needing a digital companion to your, you know, API to make it work. But at the same time, you can build all these digital barriers that are things that you're going to want in the future. And at a fraction of the cost that it takes to develop the actual clinical development process around the drug itself with human trials and other things. And, at some level, depending on the level of investment a group wants to take to bring it all to the point to which these are medical devices, they become something that's really hard to replicate and allows for, a way to carve out larger market segments and give greater benefits to the patients. So, if we take out even outside of the digital world, you look at REMS programs, the first people would like curse themselves about REMS programs. Yet at the same time, drug makers started using REMS programs to extend their patent life, essentially, by saying, well, you can't make the REMS program because you're a small generic manufacturer, so it's not equivalent, so you can't get in the market, and just held on to the same market share. And I'm not saying that that's ethical, by the way. What I'm saying is, um, things that go outside of the drug can be a positive and they can be strategically built out as a positive and they can be done cost effectively. So it's a much smaller sidecar investment that has great value if people have their eyes open at the
I
right
think
level for product.
I think that's an amazing message. I mean, we keep on having these conversations with our colleagues, clients, friends in the industry. Um, I don't know what I would like to say as a last note is that we don't just come with these concepts when we talk with our clients. We actually create a pathway on where the digital technologies can enable their value proposition before we even start, just as like a kind of a showcasing what we can do. And we start the journey together with an exploration phase, and then we carry on with a piloting phase. We do also real world evidence feasibility analyses. We look at how much this data could immediately be collected. So, we don't want to give exactly as you said, the drug development takes a long time, it's very expensive. We want these solutions to be immediately available as much as possible, and this data to be immediately captured with the right healthcare system so that the both in terms of publications, in terms of evidence that's systematically, brought back to the science, the world of science, but also to be shared immediately, as proof of concepts to payers, so it could be integrated within the pricing proposition of drugs, because obviously they are increasing they are having an impact on the effectiveness and the safety of drugs in the market. So that's, I think, what we try to do.
Yeah, and I'd say on the Graticule side, we love working with uh, Omer and his team. They're smart. They understand strategy. They understand commercial strategy. They understand, medical evidence strategy. Um, I just love data. I love like technical approaches, but I like the problems it can solve. And we like to think about, can we make research networks or can we use existing networks, whether it's IDNs or it's EMRs or it's something that forms a scale opportunity to make these things real. Because it's exciting to think about them. It's much more exciting to do them, even though it's very painful sometimes to sort of go through that process from, early concept to, you know, eureka, the value's been found, even in a small
Yeah.
scale. Um, that's the fun stuff for us. And so we like to get involved in early stages of planning because then we can try and fit things that might actually be connected to them. So
I think that's great. I think we've given enough, but we'd like to talk to people, and we'd love to have fireside chats. We'd love to have lunches, dinners, get-togethers with anyone who would like to understand this a little better. We've got a lot more examples, obviously, we would like to share. But I think maybe for today, I'll go back make myself a chicken soup, and perhaps
A nice rainy day.
continue to look after these boys and girls who are
Yeah,
slouching around and want to go to school
some
because
of
they
them
got
got to
headache.
school, some did not. I'll have to go back and see what they're up to. But yeah, thanks so much, Omer, for taking time
And
today.
thank you for the
Uh,
invitation. I hopefully will receive some questions. And as you say, we love data, but we also love to be challenged by data. So anything anybody throws at us in terms of questions, I think we'd love to answer them, won't we?
yeah, and we're fun to work with.